Years after the Ukraine war began, India has become one of Russia's biggest oil buyers. From just a trickle before 2022 to now,
a third of Indian crude imports are coming from Russia.
That's energy markets expert Vandana Hari. Seen another way,
bilateral trade has rocketed over $60 billion. I am sure oil comprises about $40 billion.
That's Nandan Unnikrishnan, a Eurasia expert at the Observer Research Foundation. So basically, we buy a third of our oil from Russia, and oil comprises more than 2/3 of our trade with the country. So the ties are significant, and India has dug its heels in on maintaining these ties. This despite pressure from the US to wean it away. Pressure in the form of up to 50% tariffs on exports and threats to increase those tariffs, accusations that Indian refiners are reselling and profiteering off Russian oil, plus a looming threat that an impending trade deal with the US could be dead on arrival. But here's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman in an interview just 2 days earlier, underlining India's defiant stance.
Will we also continue to buy Russian oil?
Yes. That's been made very plain and simple. Where we buy our oil from, especially being a big ticket foreign exchange related item, where we pay so much out of our highest in terms of import, we will have to take a call which suits us best. So we will undoubtedly be buying.
So why are we still buying Russian oil? The short answer is that it's cheap. What's the long answer? How much longer can we afford to be stubborn on this? How much room for a diplomatic maneuver do we have against the US? Are refiners indeed profiteering? What if India gives in to US's demands? What if it doesn't? How bleak are the next 2-3 months? We try to get you all answers in this episode. Listen on, it's Tuesday, the 9th of September. I'm your host Anirban Chaudhary. This is The Morning Brief. Now, India-Russia bilateral trade was hovering around $10 billion before 2022. And then it skyrocketed 6 times as we started buying oil. Why did we start buying oil from Russia? 3 clear reasons: price, availability, and politics. 1. When Europe banned most Russian oil after the Ukraine invasion in February 2022, Moscow suddenly had millions of barrels with nowhere to go. To keep revenue flowing, it had no option but to offer heavy discounts. The beneficiary? India. 2. Russia shifted tankers from Europe to Asia, creating new shipping routes to India and China. China had already been trading with Russia, so the beneficiary here again? India. 3. The West wanted to hurt Moscow's revenues but also avoid a global oil price spike if Russian oil inventory kept piling up. So, the G7 price cap system was designed so that buyers like India could keep importing but at capped or discounted rates. For India, again, it was a sweet spot. Cheap oil, no formal breach of sanctions, and freedom to pursue energy security. I asked Vandana Hari where we stand now. How does the price of Russian Urals compare to grades from elsewhere?
India is definitely getting Russian crude cheaper than comparable grades, than what would have been the case before the 22 sanctions and embargoes. The Russian crude on a landed basis in India has been roughly, I would say, about $5 a barrel, or give or take 6% cheaper. So that's substantial savings for the Indian refiners.
Roughly what share of India's crude slate is Russian now compared to, say, pre-2022 levels? And you spoke about margins. How are margins being driven by this discounted Russian oil?
From month to month, it varies a little bit. We have seen it go as high as 40%. On the lower side, we've seen more like 30% or just below that. On a ballpark basis, a third of Indian crude imports are coming from Russia. Now, what is the impact of discounted crude on Indian refiners' margins? That's a great area to look at, especially since margins have not been quite good. In fact, pretty slim. The average band of margins in the past couple of quarters, again, for the refiners have been roughly around $4 to $6 a barrel without inventory gains or losses. Now, if you look at Russian crude, let's say roughly $5 a barrel discount. And then again, if you look at a third of a refiner's slate is Russian crude, that is not the case in the actual world because the third proportion has been calculated on the basis of overall Indian imports, and it varies quite a bit from one refiner to another. Then we're looking at almost $1.50 per barrel of the GRM, the gross refining margin, being on account of this discount in Russian crude. Now, obviously, that's a big chunk of your margin if you are close to $4 a barrel, slightly slower proportion of your margin if you're closer to $6 a barrel GRM. But either way, it is quite a substantial part of the margin that Indian refiners are able to achieve.
So gross refining margin is the profit that refiners make after subtracting crude costs from product sales. Vandana calculated that Russian discounts alone are adding about $1.5 per barrel to Indian refiners' GRMs. So while margins are slim, that's $4 to $6, Russian oil imports account for a fourth or even more than a third of those margins. But there are more elements to those costs, and those impact margins too. So I asked Vandana.
Also, the discounts that Indian refiners are getting from Russian oil, is that sort of offset by the logistics, insurance costs, etc., that some reports seem to be saying?
Right. So if you compare the benchmark Russian grade Urals, which is also the lion's share of what India imports from Russia, it's a medium sour kind of crude. It's actually close to $13 discount. That's the average sort of that we've seen so far this year. However, by the time it reaches Indian shores, that discount narrows considerably to, I would say, call it $2 to $4 per barrel below Brent. That said, whatever discount Indian refiners can get, and as I mentioned, like comparable grades, it's almost $5 a barrel cheaper, or has been in recent months, it is still quite a meaningful discount for India. So yes, even taking into account all the logistical costs, that includes freight and insurance, India is still getting cheaper crude compared with competitive barrels.
Let's talk about company impact now, and specifically companies like Reliance, Nayara, etc. They have been on focus because of this tug of war with the US, whether or not to buy from Russia. Reliance is to juggle cheap Russian imports with its US-facing export markets as well. What does that balancing act look like in practice, and how do you see this going ahead?
Yeah, so Reliance and Nayara are in slightly different situations. Both are, of course, the biggest buyers, Russian crude in India. But Nayara has been outright sanctioned by the EU, right, as a result of which it's faced a lot of issues getting crude from suppliers other than Russia. Reliance has not been directly targeted, but of course, it's been mentioned or referenced to in terms of implication, correct, in a lot of comments by US senior administration officials. Now, clearly, that does place the company in a pretty awkward situation. So as of now, we have to be clear that what the US has said to India or sort of implied is that to completely halt Russian crude imports. So in that sense, the US is not specifically asking Reliance or Nayara for that matter, or any particular refiner to cut back. And let's face it, that wouldn't really even achieve any objectives for the US, because in order to put enough pressure on President Putin to make a significant erosion in Russia's oil export revenues, actually US would want in all of Indian imports to stop, and possibly all of Chinese imports and other imports to stop as well. Otherwise, it's very, very weak leverage, essentially. So as of now, Reliance is not in that sort of situation. But yes, I would assume they would be closely monitoring. From what we can tell so far, neither Reliance nor any of the other refiners in India have actually halted Russian imports. The government has not given them any instructions to either halt or reduce Russian imports. So for the time being, it's business as usual.
So the obvious question to ask you is, if India stopped buying Russian crude tomorrow, what would the math say about replacement costs, supply options, etc.?
Yeah, so as of now, that's a hypothetical question because, as you know, India has been quite defiant. I personally don't expect it to change course and revise its policy on Russian crude imports. And the additional 25% secondary tariffs that are being imposed on the country have already gone into effect, right? As far as we know, there are no active discussions happening between the US and India, whereby one would expect that perhaps there is some sort of bargaining, negotiating going on that would involve India changing course on Russian crude imports. But in the hypothetical situation, we would be looking at anywhere between 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day of Russian crude that India takes, suddenly becoming homeless. Now, yes, China could absorb a bit more. I think China would be wary of how much more it absorbs, because we know that the US has been threatening China with secondary tariffs as well. So I think it'll be careful. Also, other logistical constraints, refinery setup constraints from its commitments under term contracts with other suppliers. So all of these reasons, China would not be able to absorb all the crude freed up if India were to turn its back on Russian supplies. Now, that would be a material disruption for global oil supply, because if 1.5 million barrels per day of Russian crude gets locked out of the market, yes, there is some spare capacity within OPEC, and maybe they could replace it, but still, at least on a short-term basis, I think that would send crude prices higher.
So assuming India keeps buying from Russia, which you've said it will, how sustainable are these discounts, which is such a keystone to that trade relationship?
Yeah, so as far as crude markets for Russia are concerned, China and India are the big ones. Turkey also takes a little bit of Russian crude. And Russia really doesn't have any viable alternatives in terms of ready markets of the size of India to place its crude. Now, your question on the discount, I would assume that as long as the Ukraine war is not resolved and the Western embargoes and sanctions against Russian oil continue, the discounts will continue. The discounts will wax and wane, as we have seen in the past several months or the past few years, but the discount itself will remain in place. I think the bigger question looking further down the road is that if the Ukraine war ends and the West starts winding down its sanctions, and then perhaps Russia is able to find newer markets, that might be the case. Russia would probably then want to place some of its crude in countries like, let's say, Japan, South Korea, which were buyers before the sanctions, maybe some in Taiwan and a few other countries. But again, I would, in that case, also imagine that India would still remain an important market, because it's so much easier to place 1.5 million barrels per day in one country than try and find 5 different buyers all buying 300,000 or 400,000 barrels per day. Maybe it won't get the same amount of discount if sanctions are removed, but all of these actually thoughts for the time being remain really very, very farther down the road, because there doesn't seem to be any quick resolution to the Ukraine war.
But the math is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. With India-Russia trade expected to balloon to $100 billion in 5 years, this becomes a story about power and geopolitics, especially with the US having a huge problem with it. Here's Peter Navarro, counselor to Donald Trump.
Look, Modi's a great leader. I don't understand why he's getting to bed with Putin and Xi Jinping when he's the biggest democracy in the world. So I would just simply say to the Indian people, please understand what's going on here. You got Brahmins profiteering at the expense of the Indian people. We need that to stop.
So I asked my second guest, Nandan Unnikrishnan of ORF, 2 basic questions. why does the US have a problem with India buying Russian oil? And how much room to negotiate does India really have?
Well, the US has a problem because it definitely wants to wean India decisively away from what it considers its adversaries. And Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, these are what the United States sees as the circle of adversaries. And it does not want India to be part of that circle, either not be over friendly with this. So that is understandable. After all, the United States is trying to maintain its dominance of international affairs. The question is, what damage can the United States do to India at the bilateral level if India continues to buy similar volumes of Russian oil as it does, let's say, in August? And I think there India will have to do some serious number crunching to try and understand how this will affect its economy and how long it is willing to pay the price for whatever that pain is. So it's a difficult equation to solve, but India doesn't have much of a choice. It will have to solve it. So in that sense, the space that India has is very, very limited.
Now, what about allegations of profiteering leveled by the US? There is an irony here. India's refiners, the biggest ones being Reliance and Nayara, process Russian crude into petrol, diesel, jet fuel, and naphtha. Those refined products are then exported to global markets, including Europe and the US. Why? Because technically, sanctions apply to Russian crude, not to refined products once they leave India. That's the loophole. Now, is the US saying that India is breaking rules or violating the G7 price caps? No. Its problem is that refiners are capturing the arbitrage, buying at steep discounts, then selling refined fuels into high-priced Western markets. Basically, the allegation is that they are making windfall profits from sanctions meant to hurt Moscow.
The allegation is purely hypocritical. I mean, that is, it doesn't have a leg to stand on. Because if India is profiteering, it is only profiteering because Europe and the United States are buying. Now, they are buying it because they don't want a sudden price increase or surge in their own economies. They know that their consumers, their voters are not going to like it. So I think this whole thing about profiteering is just rhetoric. Now, the question that I would pose is, will the relationship or the energy relationship between India and Russia undergo any substantial change if India starts reducing the amount of oil that it buys from Russia? If in response to pressure from the United States, we decide to reduce, let's say, our purchases by 50%, how will Russia react to India then? That would probably be a more appropriate question. And I'm sure that Prime Minister Modi and President Putin must have discussed that possibility during their talks in Tianjin.
Right. Final question. In these energy ties with Russia, I mean, India also has ambitions for forums like I2U2, which is with the UAE and Israel, Quad, of course, which has more of a security angle. And of course, there is an imminent trade agreement with the US. Will these pressures be too much? And since you said the question to ask is whether India will curtail its oil purchase, are these pressures enough for India to take that decision, or will it just go with pure economics as it is going now?
I don't think any country takes decisions purely on an economic basis. Even every economic decision has a political element in it, and in international affairs, a geopolitical element to it. So I don't think those two are really ever separate. We've been members of BRICS and SCO and Quad without a problem. We have been promoting the North-South corridor. We have opposed the BRI, and we have also proposed the IMEC. And all three our positions were perfectly acceptable to the rest of the world. So I do not see any significant impact on India's decision to continue its oil trade with Russia. What I do see will have significant impact and could have significant impact is India's desire to achieve a bilateral trade agreement with the United States and India's desire to keep its relationship with the United States as the most important relationship in international affairs, at least for the foreseeable future. So it is a question of how India navigates those waters will determine how much oil we keep buying from Russia.
So, is this about cheap oil? Yes, but it's also about India's need to ensure energy security for its citizens. According to a latest report, there are signs that India is diversifying its oil purchases. The country's state-run refiner IOC chose to buy oil from West Africa, the Middle East and Nigeria in its latest tender. Meanwhile, just about 24 hours ago, Trump threatened a second round of sanctions on countries buying Russian oil. So, the times are bleak, volatile and aggressive, and we'll keep bringing you every twist and turn in this story in subsequent episodes. This episode was produced by Vinay Joshi, sound designed by Radhas Naik. A new episode of The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, don't miss our brand new show, Corner Office Conversation, where we talk to the most interesting business leaders from India and the world, every alternate Monday, wherever you get your podcasts. Keep listening. All external clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.